Welcome to the Wright Science Daily Revision Boost. In today's Biology Blast, we're going to have a look at ecosystems. So the first thing we actually need to do is to understand what we mean by certain key words. So when we talk about an ecosystem, that's all of the living organisms and the physical conditions in an area. If we're talking about the community, that's just the organisms within the area. The habitat is the area in which the organisms live. A producer is an organism that makes their food through photosynthesis, so things like plants, whereas a consumer is an organism that doesn't make their own food, so they've got to eat other organisms to gain energy. And finally, a decomposer, they gain their energy by feeding on dead or decaying matter. Hopefully we remember the key bits about our food chains, that the arrows show the direction the energy is moving. So we go from the producer to the primary consumer to the secondary consumer, etc. Do remember that our plants take in energy from the sun, which is then absorbed by the chlorophyll and used in photosynthesis to make glucose. And a little reminder there about both the word and the balance symbol equation for photosynthesis. The glucose is then going to be changed into things like carbohydrates and proteins inside the plant, so that when the animals eat the plants, the biomass is transferred from the plant to the animals. But just remember that some of that energy is lost due to processes like respiration. When we're talking about biomass, this is the amount of living material that's present. Remember we said our food chain actually shows the direction of the energy flow through the arrows, which means that food chains show us what organism eats what. The only other phrase we could see associated with these is the words trophic levels. So a trophic level is a feeding level that shows the position of an organism within that food chain or food web. And remember, if we've got one food chain, then that's fine, but in a habitat what we generally find is we've got a range of them which all link together in what's called a food web. There are two types of factors that could influence the actual organisms living in a habitat. The first one, the biotic factors, these are living factors, so things like the number of organisms, what organisms they are, and any competition between them. And then we've got the abiotic factors, which are the non-living or physical factors, things like temperature and pH. If we consider how these factors will influence the growth of our organisms, then light, first of all, is required for photosynthesis. So the greater the light availability, the greater the success of the plant will be. However, plants have actually evolved to grow successfully in different light intensities. So things like rhubarb plants, which are designed to grow in the shade, have much larger leaves to actually trap more sunlight. If we think about temperature, we know that affects the enzymes that control these metabolic reactions. So that if we've got warm temperatures, then it's going to aid the rapid developments of plants, as their metabolic reactions will happen faster. If we think about some of the cold-blooded or ectotherm creatures that we've got on the planet, like lizards, then what happens is they require the sun to warm them up in the morning to get their actual enzymes working at a much faster pace. If we think about water, lack of water will lead to death. And if plants have a lack of water, they will wilt and the cells are no longer turgid, which means they're not going to be carrying out photosynthesis at the same rate they were. The last factor is pH, and the pH will affect biological activity in the soil and the availability of different minerals. We also need to consider how we can actually detect the amounts of these abiotic factors or get a reading of them. So if we're looking for light intensity, we use a light meter. If it's moisture, we use a humidity sensor. If we're trying to measure the pH, it's a pH probe. And if we want to know the temperature, it's a thermometer. The last thing we're going to consider is competition and interdependence. So we know that in order to survive, both plants and animals need a number of materials from their surroundings. And if those materials are limited, then they have to compete for them. So what we find as a result of that is the weaker competitor may die or leave the area. When we use the word population, we're talking about the number of organisms of each species living in an area, and competition will have a direct effect on population size. So just remember that it's both plants and animals that are competing here. So plants will be competing for water, light, minerals, etc. And animals will be competing for food, water, breeding partners, etc. When we use the word interdependence, it's how different organisms depend on each other in a community. So we find we've got three different types of ecological relationship. First one, predation, so that's the relationship between predators and prey, and make sure that you can explain the shapes in the predator and prey graph at the bottom. Second one, mutualism, which is where both organisms are going to benefit from this relationship. And the third one, parasitism, is where only the parasite benefits. The host actually suffers, and a good example of that are tapeworms. In today's chemistry check, we're going to be looking at those key groups on the periodic table we need to know. So the first one is group 1, which are the alkali metals. Do remember our group 1 metals are very reactive with oxygen and water, so we store them in oil to prevent them reacting with them. Some typical properties that they've got, they have those typical properties of metals, so they're shiny when they're freshly cut, they're good conductors of electricity, and they're solid at room temperature. And some of the trends that they've got as we go down the group, they become softer, their density increases, and their melting point decreases. So hopefully you remember the experiment that we did in class for this one. So when we drop lithium in the water, it fizzed rather slowly around the surface. The sodium turned into that molten ball, moved quickly and fizzed quite a lot. And the potassium caught fire, burnt with that lilac flame, moved really quickly and may explode. So we need to know the word equation. So the metal plus water makes metal hydroxide plus hydrogen. Just remember to change the word metal for whichever alkali metal it is. And our balance symbol equation, which is underneath. And the key thing with this is, remember, hydrogen goes around as H2 and then put a 2 in front of everything else in the equation, and then it will balance every time. Hopefully you remember that if they're in group 1, that means they have 1 electron in their outer shell. And we know the reactivity increases as we go down the group. The reason for that is that it's easier to lose that outer shell electron. So because it's easier to lose it, it is more reactive. Second group we're going to consider are group 7, the halogens. So first thing to remember about these is they're always found as diatomic molecules. So that means they go around as a pair, Cl2, I2, Br2. Don't forget the 2. We do need to know their state and colour at room temperature. So fluorine, chlorine are both gases. Bromine is a liquid, and iodine and astatine are solids. And in terms of their colour, they start with a very pale colour, so we go from pale yellow to green to orange to grey to a dark grey black colour. They've got some typical properties that they're brittle when they're solid and they're poor electrical conductors. And then the trends as we go down the group, they change from a gas to a solid, their melting and boiling points increase, they're darker in colour and their density increases. If we actually take one of our group 7 elements and react them with a metal, we produce a salt, which is called a metal halide. So just remember that if we're starting off with our halogen, then we're going to change the ending of it to an IDE when it's joined with the metal. So the reactivity of our halogens will decrease the further down the group you go, because it's going to be harder for the element to gain an electron as the force of attraction from the nucleus is less because we've got more shells there. Do remember though, they all have those similar chemical properties because they're all in group 7 and therefore all have 7 electrons in their outer shell. So what they're going to do is gain 1 electron in reactions to make an ion that's got a single negative charge. One of the key types of reaction we need to know about is the halogen displacement reactions. So when we refer to a halide, that's a compound of a halogen and 1 other element. And what we find is that in a displacement reaction, a more reactive halogen will displace the less reactive halogen from the halide. And you can see that happening at the bottom there in that little picture. So if they ask you to write a balance symbol equation for this, just swap the halogen symbols around, everything else stays the same, assuming you've got a more reactive halogen and a less reactive one in the halide. We do use our half equations here to model what happens to each reactant. So what we can see in this equation, we've got both a reduction and an oxidation occurring, which is shown here. And remember, the half equation, we're going to use E- to represent an electron. Our next group is group 0, the noble gases. So helium, neon, argon, krypton, xenon and radon. The reason they're called the noble gases is that they are unreactive, so they don't take part in many chemical reactions. Few key properties: they're non-metals, they're all gas at room temperature as the name suggests, and they have full outer shells, which is why they are unreactive. They will be going around as monatomic molecules, so that means they're only single atoms with weak forces of attraction between them, and this means that they've got low boiling points because the forces of attraction are very easily overcome. In terms of the trends for our noble gases, as we go down group 0, the attractive forces between the atoms get stronger, so the boiling point increases and their density will also increase. Last one we're going to look at are the transition metals. So they're all metals and they're found between groups 2 and 3 on the periodic table. So a few key properties they've got: they're shiny when freshly cut, they're good conductors of electricity, they're strong, they're malleable, all the properties you'd expect of metals. If we compare group 1 and the transition metals, we find the transition metals are stronger, harder, have a higher density and a higher melting point. In terms of the chemical properties of our transition metals, then they react very slowly if they react at all. So a good example of that is iron, which obviously reacts with oxygen and water to make hydrated iron 3 oxide or rust. So metals like platinum, however, won't react with water or oxygen. We do find that our transition metals are slightly different to the others in the fact that they can form more than one type of ion. And the way we know the charge on the ion is by the Roman numeral in brackets. If we consider more of our chemical properties then, the transition metals produce coloured ionic compounds, whereas the alkali metals tend to either be white or colourless compounds. Transition metals are good catalysts, so that means they will speed up chemical reactions without being used up themselves. And a good example of where we use them is in catalytic converters in cars that use platinum, rhodium and palladium to convert harmful exhaust gases into less harmful ones. In today's physics prep, we're going to have a little look at waves. So a wave is an oscillation that transfers energy, and we've got two types of wave. Mechanical waves that require a medium to travel, like sound and water, and electromagnetic waves which do not need a medium to travel. So when we're talking about waves, they can either be transverse or longitudinal. So in transverse waves, the vibrations are at right angles to the direction of the wave, as you can see in the bottom right diagram. And in longitudinal waves, the vibrations are in the same direction as the wave travels, as shown in the bottom left diagram. So just remember, in our longitudinal waves, those compressions are areas of high pressure and the rarefactions areas of low pressure. And then we're going to have a look at the key features on our waves in a moment. So there are 4 definitions that we need to know. Amplitude is the distance from the middle to the top or bottom of the wave, and that's usually in meters but does depend on the wave for its units. Wavelength, the distance from one point on a wave to the same point on the next wave, and that is measured in meters. The frequency is the number of waves or oscillations per second, measured in hertz. And the time period is the time for one wave to pass a given point, which is given in seconds. So when we're looking at our waves, we can represent them in one of 2 ways, either as a time trace or a snapshot. So both of these graphs will allow us to measure amplitude from the middle to the top or bottom of the wave. But the time trace is going to show something different. So this one has displacement on our y-axis and time on our x-axis. So this shows how displacement varies with time at any given position. So what we can do here is we can measure the time period from any point on a wave to the same point on the next. If we're asked to calculate the time period, you could also do that as 1 divided by the frequency of the wave. Second is the snapshot, which has displacement on the y-axis but distance on the x-axis. So you've got to look at your x-axis to know which type of graph we've got here. So the calculation we need to know for our P5 topic is wave velocity. So wave velocity in meters per second is the frequency in hertz times the wavelength in meters. Don't forget, frequency is the number of waves passing a given point each second, and the wavelength is the distance from one point on a wave to the same point on the next wave, just in case they ask you to measure the wavelength from a graph first of all. We do need to know how a ripple tank can be used here. So to calculate velocity, we need wavelength and frequency. So to measure the wavelength, you can put a ruler in the tank and just measure it by eye, or we can use a stroboscope to freeze the waves and then use the ruler to measure the wavelength. To do frequency, we place a marker in the tank and count the waves passing it each second, or you just put a small piece of paper touching the top of our vibrating bar as it does, and then listen to the bar vibrating and count each vibration. We've got two ways that we can work out the velocity of sound. First, measure a distance you stand from a wall, clap and time how long it takes to hear an echo, then use speed as distance divided by time. Or connect a pair of microphones a set distance apart to an oscilloscope, and then use the oscilloscope to work out the time between the wave reaching each microphone. From that, we can then calculate the velocity. Now we've had a quick recap, then head on over to socrative.com and test your knowledge on the topics from today. The room name you need to enter is Wright 2662. Good luck! As always, if there's anything we've gone over that you're not 100% certain on, then head on over to the playlist to get a little bit more in-depth information. So for biology, it's B4, for chemistry, C4, and for physics, if you're doing combined science, it's P4, but if you're doing the separate sciences, then it's the physics P5 playlist.